Now, this revelation was coming out at the same time the public was learning about the warrantless wiretapping program, in which the White House had acted on its very broad theory of executive power to bypass a 1978 law that required the government to obtain a warrant from a judge anytime it wanted to spy on the telephone calls or emails of an American. As with the torture ban and the signing statement, Patriot Act signing statement controversies, the Bush administration was arguing that the warrantless wiretapping program centered around the war on terror and the new situation that had arisen after September 11th. But I kept digging more, and I learned that this agenda of concentrating more unchecked power in the White House predated 9/11. In fact, I learned behind closed doors on January 21st, 2001, the day after the inauguration, then White House counsel Alberto Gonzales had talked about a goal of expanding presidential power at the very first meeting of the White House legal team. The President, Gonzales, had said back in January of 2001, long before 9/11, wanted that legal team to seek out opportunities to expand presidential power in order to leave the office stronger than it had been when they arrived. Their goal was a permanent expansion of executive authority, not just for themselves, but for all future presidents to wield as well, whoever that happened to be at any given moment, including Democrats. The war on terrorism, of course, would provide a mechanism for turning this pre-existing agenda, or throwing this pre-existing agenda into overdrive. And as I talked to former administration officials, I also learned that this agenda was primarily not the work of Mr. Bush. In fact, instead it was coming out of Vice President Cheney's office. And on a day-to-day level, it was the handiwork primarily of Cheney's longtime aide, a man named David Addington. Now, when the warrantless wiretapping program had been revealed, Cheney had told reporters in a very, very rare press conference that if they were interested in why the administration thought that it had all the constitutional power it needed to bypass that warrant law, they should look up a report that he had overseen back in 1987 when he was a member of Congress and Addington was his aide, during the Iran-Contra scandal. And that, of course, was the scandal in which several officials in the Reagan administration had conspired to bypass a law cutting off assistance to anti-Marxist rebels in Nicaragua. So I took Cheney's advice. I dug up a copy of his old report. I blew the dust off the cover. And I read about how he had thought it was perfectly legal for the president or his top aides to bypass a law that limited what they could do in matters of foreign affairs or national security. It turned out that Cheney had articulated this vision of nearly limitless commander-in-chief power 2 decades earlier. And now, as vice president, he was in a position to bring that vision into a reality. At this point, the full sweep and implications of the administration's project came into sharper focus for me. Like many reporters, I had been focused on a close-up of 1 or 2 controversies, but I had been missing the broader context. And now the camera had zoomed way out to bring the full panorama into view. And suddenly what the Bush administration had been doing across a huge range of issues made much more sense. The claim that a president could wiretap without warrants in defiance of a statute, the claim that he could simply declare that he didn't need to obey the Geneva Conventions when it came to prisoners picked up in Afghanistan, Cheney's fight to keep his Energy Task Force papers a secret, and the attacks on other open government laws that required the executive branch to let the public know what it was doing with its power, such as the Freedom of Information Act and the Presidential Records Act. The decision in December of 2001 to pull out of an international treaty that had been ratified by the Senate, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, without asking the Senate if it wanted to de-ratify it. The choices of presidential lawyers to be Supreme Court justices. Unprecedented efforts to centralize greater White House control over Justice Department lawyers, government scientists, and other executive branch bureaucrats. And an issue that's close to General Romig's heart and many others in this room, I dare say, systematic efforts to subordinate the JAGs in the Pentagon to greater control by politically appointed lawyers in order to undermine their ability to provide independent legal advice to their commanders about such matters as whether the president's interpretation of the Geneva Conventions was in fact correct. These and other disparate controversies seemed to not be connected to each other, but in fact they were united at the root. The administration, from its very beginning, had set out to take actions that would establish precedents, permanently expanding presidential power for the long term, even when such tactics brought them extra short-term political difficulties, even when they could have accomplished the same policy goals through less controversial means, such as asking Congress to change the warrant law as part of the Patriot Act after 9/11. The signing statement story, as amazing as it was thus really just the tip of an iceberg, just one tactic for centralizing power among many that were simultaneously in play. In short, a quiet but sweeping constitutional revolution was well underway. I kept asking the question, why? What was driving Dick Cheney and the other presidentialists, as they sometimes call themselves, who were so relentlessly, ingeniously, systematically pushing this agenda, about which they were saying nothing to people, and in fact about which they had said nothing to voters when they were campaigning for the office? Where was this coming from? This question took me to Ann Arbor, Michigan, to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, where the National Archives houses a bookcase full of documents in gray boxes entitled Richard Cheney Files. And from that pile of memos, the answer to what was motivating this push emerged. Now, to explain the origins of Cheney's worldview, I need to back up very briefly to review what the founders had to say about how a government of checks and balances is supposed to operate, even in the face of national security threats. And then I need to fast forward to how the United States began to stray from that vision during the early Cold War, leading up to Cheney's formative experiences. In 1787, when they sat down to draft the Constitution, the founders brought with them a very realistic, and some would say pessimistic, view of human nature. They knew that human beings are flawed, all of us. And so it is inevitable that from time to time, misguided or incompetent leaders will win responsibility in positions of responsibility in government. And they also knew that people in power cannot always be trusted to do the right thing and make all the right decisions on their own. And so they designed a system that would prevent the concentration of too much power in any one official's hands. The basic outline of their system, of course, was to give Congress broad power to enact laws establishing rules and regulations within which the president would have to operate as he ran the government from day to day. The founders made clear that they wanted the Congress to be the branch that made the tough decisions about policy trade-offs in such matters as, explicitly, how the commander-in-chief may treat captured enemies in wartime. Despite the tremendous threats facing the fledgling nation, they believed America would be more secure, not less, if the commander-in-chief, whatever flawed human being happened to occupy that office at any given moment, were subject to the rule of law. Now, there were some short-term bumps along the way, of course, most notably the first few months of the Civil War, but this system endured essentially intact for 160 years. But then, amid the national security fears of the early Cold War, President Harry Truman, a Democrat, I hasten to emphasize, did something that was unprecedented in U.S. history. In 1950, Truman took us to war in Korea without going to Congress and permission. The first time any president had taken the United States into a major overseas war without authorization. And this launched the era of what the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. would dub the Imperial Presidency. Truman and his successors of both parties embraced a theory that presidents have broad, unwritten, but inherent powers as commander-in-chief to protect national security as they alone see fit and at their discretion.